Hey FFR listeners, this is the producer Rob speaking. It's that time of year when everyone starts to think about the important things in life, like our taxes. Did you know that a donation to Feminist Frequency is actually tax deductible? If you have a few bucks a month to spare, head on over to patreon.com/femfreak, F-E-M-F-R-E-Q. Help us out, but also help yourself to all the great exclusive content that's available only to people who are signed up on our Patreon.
Nicholas Holt's character, we learn, was aware of the entire conceit of this night. So why was he taking pictures of the food? When was he gonna look at those?
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian.
And I'm Kat Spada, and this is the final course of our 3-episode series, Eat the Rich. But we're still hungry.
I read it in the script and I was still surprised that he said it. Good thing, because we made reservations for dinner at the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant that money can buy. We watched the 2022 film The Menu.
Directed by Mark Mylod, this high-concept comedy thriller stars Anya Taylor-Joy as Margot, one of several unsuspecting diners at an isolated restaurant led by the severe and intimidating Chef Slowik, played by Ralph Fiennes. As the evening unfolds, the courses served up by Slowik's army of devoted staff grow more and more twisted, leading to mind games and violence. The ensemble cast includes Hong Chau as Slowik's maitre d', Nicholas Holt as Margot's date, a pretentious foodie, and Janet McTeer and John Leguizamo among a coterie of the wealthy and famous. Although The Menu was not recognized by this year's Academy Awards, when Chau received her Best Supporting Actress nomination for her role in Darren Aronofsky's The Whale, many on film Twitter pretended that the nod was for this film instead. In particular, her delivery of the line, tortillas deliciosas.
Joining us is Soleil Ho, a James Beard award-winning food, culture, and travel writer who is the San Francisco Chronicle's restaurant critic. Their podcasts include the Chronicle's Extra Spicy, and they co-founded Racist Sandwich, a show about the intersections of gender, race, and class with food. Soleil is the co-writer of Meal, a graphic novel about culinary mentorship, queer romance, and bug eating, also known as
entomophagy.
They're currently working on The Memory of Taste, a cookbook from Oakland chef to David Fu, coming this year. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk about rich people and the food they love.
I have so many questions. I mean, this is inspired, think piece upon think piece, but what has been, have people in the food world been talking about this movie, or has it been just kind of I hate it when movies try to pretend they know what's going on in our world.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of chit-chat about this movie in the food world among restaurant workers who talk about how it mirrors a lot of the big stories that happened in the food world recently. I know that the writers read the story about the Willow's Inn in Washington that had a huge, it's very similar. It's like a Michelin-starred restaurant that was internationally renowned and was on an island and, was known for all of this sort of very precious farm-to-table type stuff. And it turned out to be, 1, really abusive. 2, they got a lot of produce from Costco. Just a lot of subterfuge and not so accurate kind of things that they were doing. Things like the pre-dinner tour, right? And the nature of all the creatures that come in to eat these sorts of meals felt very accurate to a lot of people.
I felt a little attacked in the best way, I think, it's interesting. I've done a lot of fancy meal stuff. And so I think for those of us who have done this, it's kind of this I laughed a lot at the beginning of this movie because I was like, yep, this feels like a accurate, somewhat exaggerated, but not totally way that people talk about food, the way that people are treated in these restaurants, the over the topness of it, the expectation around kind of being an amateur food expert in coming into these spaces and using words like mouthfeel and shit, Yeah,
I think that's what the movie does really well, is that it sort of, if you are familiar with that world and you're part of it, there are these little moments of recognition of like, oh, they got that right. They got that right. And then, you're called into question for like, okay, but like, if this is familiar to you, what does that say about you and the kind of world that you're propping up through this kind of hobby, right? Yeah, I don't know how far we want to go into the movie right now off the bat, but
yeah, go for it.
I think the big thing, there were so many accurate like moments, and the movie uses metaphorical violence to talk about real like structural violence in the restaurant world.
No.
The big thing at the center though is that for me, the kitchen was too diverse.
Interesting.
In the world of fine dining, there's not a ton of diversity in the ranks of folks in the highest echelons, right? And the ones that have more diversity, let's say Noma in Copenhagen, they get people who intern and stage, work for free for that restaurant from all around the world. And that's a really interesting part of the experience there. People from Thailand, people from Senegal, like everywhere. But they're obviously being exploited. Like, it's obvious. It is just, you have to have tons of expendable wealth to actually volunteer, in air quotes, for these restaurants and get that line on your resume. Like any sort of prestigious internship in any industry, you have to have connections or you have to have money or both. And so I can't see a diverse kitchen being willing to die for their chef. You know what I mean? Like everywhere I've worked.
Yeah.
I've worked at restaurants that have been very diverse and like in all sorts of contexts. And, generally speaking, the people of color that worked at them, we all had a pretty sober view of working for white chefs. So that was the one part that I was like, what? Okay. Like emotionally, everything felt very on pitch, but that was the one thing where I was like, what? No.
I want to dig into that a little, let's get a little granular on that actually, because, and we're just going to jump straight to spoiler or whatever, like this movie is on HBO. You can watch it. So yeah, like the concept of we're all going to die was theoretically come up with by this woman who works in the kitchen who had been harassed by the chef. So like we're supposed to believe that was her idea. But the workers that we do kind of get like a snapshot of are this white woman who had been harassed, Hong Chau, who plays the maitre d', who's like the kind of second in command of this like militant family here. And then is it just two white men that we really see? Like the one who wants to be like Chef Slowick, the sous chef, and then the one who's pretending to be a Coast Guardsman. Like, is that like, that's an interesting, everyone else is still just kind of a background, like part of the background painting. I hadn't really thought about that, about like these, the kitchen staff and their agency in any of this. Like they kind of fall into maybe the John Leguizamo's assistant role where it's like, well, you're here, so you're part of it. Like,
there's also this is interesting in the context of they are really setting up a class warfare dynamic in a lot of ways here, which could be interesting if they addressed what Soleil is talking about, right? Like, instead, it's like there's just a lot of white people who are not in the 1% that are like the folks who are the workers, right? And that also comes into play when Anya Taylor-Joy's character is revealed to be a sex worker and isn't one of them, right? Like she disrupts the performance and what the chef was trying to do, I guess, or what they were all trying to do in this space. And so you're aligning, there's an alignment, a class alignment here that is happening along race lines and whiteness, really.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm ever going to be the person who is like, this work of art that didn't hit the mark because it didn't address this thing that it didn't want to, which is fine, right?
Right.
But to me, it came off as doing a reboot of, Lord of the Flies and making it more racially diverse. Like, that doesn't work, right? Like, that movie, that book is about, like, young white British boys and, like, how they are interpolated into state violence. as part of their sort of, natural state, which is, using the natural and civilization as metaphors. So this movie, it didn't make sense to me. It just didn't make sense to me on that level of just, and it's funny, right? To be like, wait, this is too diverse. I kind of sound like a right winger here, but it just didn't.
No, that's fair though. I feel like I've been watching, I feel like in the wave of the last decade where it's like unacceptable to have films that are all white people, you have these sort of wedged in people of color who are like the main character's best friend or partner in ways that you're like, or even if there is a main character, you're still like, this is a white movie, right? Like this is about white people and whiteness. And just because you cast a person of color sort of tangentially in this space, it's still very much situated there. So I just wanted to like, I know you're like, you made the joke about sounding like a right winger, but like it still isn't really authentic. So
but it's a flattening of reality. Like just to say like, well, it looks a certain way doesn't mean that it feels or reads a certain way.
Right. Yes.
I'm glad you brought up Noma for a couple of reasons. But one, I think it's very interesting that when this movie came out, or shortly after this movie came out, Noma is shutting down. They announced that they were closing. And also a bunch of accusations came out about Rene Redzepi, the chef of Noma, which I'm sure is like common knowledge in food circles. But the fact that it was like sort of publicly spread around, I think is very interesting that it's, I don't know if it was timed to this or whatever, but there's something interesting about like watching a film display this level, right? It's the same kind of caliber level of like food service with a chef that like, yeah, obviously he's shitty. Like this is not new in the chef world to have that. And like you were talking about the workers who are exploited, right? And I went to Noma and you get like a tour of the kitchen and shit, and you see that, and like there's this one dish that I had that was fucking amazing. I don't actually think Noma's amazing, but whatever, that's a different conversation. I think it's fascinating and interesting. But there's this one dish that was like really fucking amazing to me, and it was like like chocolate covered moss, which is the most insane thing to make. And the only way they could make it is because they have like 10 interns like meticulously picking the fucking dirt off of that moss before they like flash. I don't fucking know food shit. It's fine. And so like you're back there after spending hundreds of dollars and like enjoying this meal and watching these people kind of like, it's a jarring experience if you're paying attention, like if you're actually like watching it happen and recognizing that these kinds of meals come at a cost.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the conversations that people have around fast fashion, for instance, apply very much so to food. And I think restaurants are really effective ways to talk about the engines of capitalism and alienation and labor, these like kind of juicy, big issues in the world of production and making money off of that and off of people's excess time, right? And in very similar ways as, let's say, like an Adidas sneaker, fine dining is fetishized pretty heavily. And we are only just beginning to talk about labor in that regard. And not even just, not even like a real conversations. We just acknowledge that, yes, a team of people made this, but we still are very involved in, chef celebrity culture and in the ideology of the genius who makes all of this food from nothing, So I think we need more practice at talking about the bigger picture of labor and production in food, but it's pretty urgent for a lot of people who work in that world.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a really excellent analogy to fashion because and I want us to talk a little bit about like capital A authenticity or whatever, because I feel like that's a big thing the movie is getting at and that a lot of these stories try to get at. Do we think about the migrant farm worker that's involved in our in the production of our meals as much? Like that's a question that I would ask and I'll recommend to anyone. Gosh, I'll try to find the link for the show notes, but there was like an Edward R. Murrow investigative report about migrant farm workers that aired on Thanksgiving night in 1960, and you can watch it and it's fantastic, and it's still really relevant all these years later. But I wanted to ask you all, like, I was kind of surprised when I was watching this movie. I thought it was going to be a little more intellectual than it was. And when I kind of realized, like, oh, this is like a funny, fun movie. Like, this isn't really trying as hard as I expected it to. I mean, maybe that's weird to go into it with that expectation. But I'm thinking about this movie and The Bear, which Anita and I both watched and loved. And there's been several others. I suddenly remember the movie The 100-Foot Journey, where there's this kind of positioning of like, yes, this is all full of like sort of artifice. And well, you have to really get down to authenticity. And what does authenticity mean? And in The 100-Foot Journey, it's like this guy whose dream is to go on to like stage at Noma, but he is successful with an Indian restaurant. And how does that affect his sense of self? Like here, ultimately, are we supposed to feel like it's more authentic if you strip all of this away? Like, is that the value? I mean, I really don't know. I don't know what message I was supposed to come away from this with. Like, yeah, man, if only I can have the best crinkle cut fry, then I'll like truly understand the joy of food. Like, I really don't know what I was supposed to feel.
Oh my gosh. You know, when you mentioned that, I am reminded of, have you two seen Pig? The movie with...
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So there's that moment when Nicolas Cage has that conversation with this chef that he used to mentor, right? Who's making fine dining. And he's like, didn't you want to open a diner? Right. And the guy like just kind of breaks under that question. And then have you two seen, Always Be My Maybe?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that conversation that the two lead characters have, you know, one's a chef and one isn't, about, you know, and she's making this fine dining kind of Vietnamese restaurant. And he's just like, why don't you make real food? You know, that people eat, not just, you know, Asian food for white people. And like, you know, there's this gesture towards an authenticity conversation that has been repeated in media lately about restaurants and about, you know, and in large part about art, of people who are making compromises that are, you know, more commercial and not making the food that's really close to their heart, and that there's a real somewhere, there's a there, you know, that they are not fulfilling, and that is the gaping hole, and that is the solution to whatever conflict has come up in this film. And I think that is a really interesting idea, because it's almost like Christmas Carol-y a little bit, right? Like, you have to find the heart, you have to find the soul beyond like the cold capitalist logic.
Right.
But in the same time, it all just comes back to a capitalist solution. You know, and Always Be My Maybe, she opens a home-style Korean restaurant. In Pig, you know, the solution is to, you know, maybe open a diner. And it's interesting. I don't know.
I just watched Big Night, the Stanley Tucci Campbell Scott film, and it is very similar to this, because the struggle is that these are two Italian immigrants, and the one of the brothers, who's like the like genius chef, is making really authentic food, and people just don't like it. And like, you know, there's a customer that comes in that's like, I want meatballs on my spaghetti, and like, he freaks out because he's like, that's not how it's supposed to be, and they're not successful, and they're not making any money, and they're like about to go under because they're like serving this like authentic food. And so it reminded me, when you were talking, of this kind of concept of like, if you want to be successful in the food world, which is a very challenging world to be successful in, the restaurant world specifically, that you have to cater to like the whims of the public and like what they want, you know?
It's funny too, because all of those things, spaghetti and meatballs or a burger with fries, like those are very commercially viable at the same time. And it's actually harder to sell fine dining. And it's just like a really weird sort of twisted up idea, right? Where like there's the commercially viable, I mean, like all of these things are, it just depends on class, right? But you're going to make a lot more money selling burgers.
I mean, food is also it's like so emotional in a way that I would say is like more than, I don't know. I was going to say like more than fashion, but it's just tied up in so many other things that like, I feel like you could apply this like Chef Slowick level of ideology to like any kind of thing. Like, you know, there are people who are like raw food movement people, right? Who might say that any interference with what Mother Nature has given us is not acceptable. And it's like, well, okay, just by virtue of like breeding plants, we're interfering, right? Like, there is no like purest form of any of this. And so trying to like, the only storytelling version I can think of is Babette's Feast, which I watched years ago. So I'm trying to remember, like, they create this like extremely high-end meal, but they just feed it to people. Like, they aren't selling it. But they still have to like access. They have to spend a lot of money to access all of these ingredients and then to prepare everything. But it's almost like that, like you said, the Christmas Carol moment of like just breaking bread, sharing a meal with people out of love is like the only true experience of food. And we see that in everything's trying to get at that, right? Like, is that the moment that brings people together? You know, here in this movie, everyone who's there is there for some like, because of some fraught or transactional relationship. Like, and so only if you are truly like, Anita brought me some ice cream she made and it was just lovely. You know, like, is that the only like real encounter we can have with food? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it really does put into question just the really difficult thing that food has to carry and the things that restaurants have to carry. They are just such transparently commercial enterprises that through which you can see so many of the excesses of capitalism. And yet they also have to carry all of this sentimental meaning for people as servers of food, as suppliers of these emotional moments like what you're talking about. And it is a hard thing to, it's a conflict, it's a contradiction in its existence, the restaurant's existence, that makes it such a, I don't know, just so enjoyable to talk about and write about, I think.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the role of the critic in this? Like, I know that Jonathan Gold, you know, would talk about this, like how his presence at a restaurant would change the trajectory of that restaurant, you know, and here there's a critic character in this movie and she's seen as this very, she's the, oh man, why can't I think of words? The person, the death with the scythe, like she comes in
the Grim Reaper.
The Grim Reaper, thank you. The death with the scythe for restaurants. Like, that's how the critic is played in this. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I loved the critic character. She's so pretentious and so New York City. I just thought that was wonderful.
I loved her sycophant, who was just like, yes, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, it reminds me too of the critic in, Ratatouille as well. And I think a lot of the movies that Pixar has made in that sort of era are very much about individuality and individualism and like very pro-individual. And so the critic is the one that quashes that because they have a set of expectations. And, I'm sure you have plenty of material to talk about as far as the cult of the individual. But I think that the critic is a force of normativity. I think that is the interesting part of the role, is like you tell people as the tastemaker, like what they should expect from an experience, or, how to contextualize an experience using, whatever is in your toolbox as far as ideas, ideology, reference. Because a lot of people aren't going to go to these restaurants, right? So they are going to rely on you to describe this thing for them so they can be in on it. And so I think including that was a really interesting part of the movie. I think that using that character to talk about the sort of greater media sphere and how, this sort of restaurant is constructed and how, the expectations put on people like, the character of Slowick are constructed. And throughout the film, the critic character is the one that tells them, like, no, this is part of the act, right? Like, then she does this act of kind of normativity in the film that I thought was really spot on for like what her job actually is.
There's a part of the movie that like actually really stuck with me. So when the movie ended, I literally said, why was this movie made? I don't know what it was, but like this movie just didn't, and that's an extremely unfair thing to say, but fucking whatever. I like, the kind of dark humor of it didn't really work with me, even though like I can understand why people liked it. And so I left the movie just kind of feeling like, okay, but why? Like, what are you saying? Or what, like, I just had a hard time really appreciating it in the way that I think it was, many people did. And not because I have any problem with making fun of or satirizing or ridiculing like high-end food culture, right? But one thing did really stick with me, and it was when the guy who brought the Anya Taylor-Joy's character was just so fucking annoying and obnoxious. And you're like, yes, we've all met these people. We know these people. We've probably been these people to some degree. He talks about this tool that they use, which I cannot remember the name of. I think it's used to make ice cream or something like that.
Jet.
Yes, a Paco Jet. Thank you. And I actually really kind of like internalized and appreciated when the chef was like, you're ruining the magic. Like the obsession that like the just regular average restaurant goer has in the at this echelon, I guess, to just know everything and know how it's all done kind of does destroy the magic of the experience of like, yeah, like we don't have these things in our home kitchens. Like there's a reason this food tastes like it tastes, and there's a reason why it's so expensive, and there's a reason why it takes so long to make, because like it's fucking impossible to do as a home cook, And that kind of stuck with me a little bit of just being like, what is that line, And like, yeah, you could make the argument that it's different for everyone, but I did appreciate that kind of idea of like, these are kind of magical experiences going into these spaces, and like being able to have this experience and these tastes and these textures and all of this stuff. And like, are we ruining it by knowing too much about it?
I think to some degree, the movie was about fandom.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Because you have the fans.
You're so smart. Oof, that's such a great observation.
That's why John Leguizamo's there.
Yeah, right? And all the fan ecosystems, you have the ones who want to pick everything apart. I think about, video game fans who want to identify like, oh, this blade of grass does not look as good because they use this engine versus that engine, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the ones who just don't really know what it's about. They're just there. They just like are participating to participate. And then you have the ones that are doing it for clout, and then the other ones that are doing it just as a sort of social capital thing. So, it was, you have all of those characters in the menu as well.
My housemate and I are watching The Last of Us together. And I like last night as we were watching the 4th episode or whatever, this is coming out way later, but I was like, oh, we're watching this in such a specific video gamey way where it's like, where we're like, oh, so the next scene should be this thing because that's the next thing that's coming up in the game. So like, are they going to do that? Or are they not going to do that? Or like, oh, they did this instead of this, or they introduced like, and it's just, I cannot stop. We cannot stop watching it removed from the fandom. I mean, whatever. I'm not like a huge Last of Us fan, but removed from the experience of that thing because you are so deep in this space, right? And that is such a different viewing than Kat, like you're watching the show. You have no idea that Kathleen wasn't in the game, that's a brand new character they made up for the show, or that they like scrapped all these other scenes and decided to do this one or whatever, like that kind of thing. So that just reminded me of like the different ways that people approach things and the different ways that fans approach things.
Well, I worked for movie studios, and when I stopped, it took me a couple years to enjoy watching movies again because I knew too much about how the sausage was made. And like, that's, I'm Mexican American. I grew up eating offal and like, pig's feet and stuff like that. And when I talk to people who didn't have that experience, I'm kind of like, yeah, but you eat meat. So like, what don't you want to know? Like there is even that element of just like how people really do want to divorce themselves from like the production element of it. I mean, we would apply that to to our iPhones, like, or whatever, but that's even more like what that critic is also there for, to just be like almost just unimpressed by the magic of it, whereas Nicholas Holt's character is deeply impressed by it, but he's also like completely doing an autopsy of like the entire situation. Now I have a plot hole logic question that only just occurred to me. Nicholas Holt's character, we learn, was aware of the entire conceit of this night. So why was he taking pictures of the food? When was he gonna look at those?
When do we look at pictures of food that we take, though?
I mean, I do, but I'm a weirdo.
It could be that he was
It
planning
helps me remember.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a really good point. Also, it's worth pointing out, too, and this isn't a plot hole, but like he knew they were going to die and he brought a sex worker with him because she's disposable.
Yeah. That's,
Yeah. Like, and that's not like not addressed, but it's like, it's just another layer that was brought into this film to talk about this class distinction, right? And there's something also kind of fucked up about the chef being like, are you with them or are you with us? As if he's not of the higher echelon here either, right? As the head chef, as a celebrity guy, that he's like creating this distinction between him and the patrons when they're the same class of people.
Yeah, that was something that also is a little confusing. Like when he makes a show of the wealthy investor that has come aboard to keep this restaurant afloat, and then those finance bros who work for that investor are there, and I kind of was like, yeah, again, why are you distancing yourself from them? Like, maybe he's not. Maybe that's the point, is that he's like, we're all complicit in this, and so we got to go down in a blaze of glory or something. But he was very much like, no, there's like clear levels here, and I'm a class of my own because I'm also a genius, and that separates me from everyone else.
I would argue with that, because I think that in real life, chefs, even celebrity chefs, I wouldn't count them as part of the 1% at all. When you think about politics or just, political bodies in terms of, who's at the top and who's at the bottom, I would group chefs in with the bottom. And I think it is okay to interpret that conversation that you're referring to as something pretty stark in that way. Because by and large, I mean, even a chef who's gotten restaurant reviews and write-ups, their life is one of constant toil and stress and awfulness and blue-collar labor. And really, there's only the Thomas Kellers of the world, who are maybe a dozen human beings that don't do that kind of thing.
I'm glad you called that out, because as I was saying that, I was like, they're also beholden to the financiers of these spaces. And just because you get a lot of write-ups and your name is known, being visible doesn't necessarily equal financial success. And I think that that's like a huge problem with our contemporary sort of influencer world, which the Triangle actually kind of acknowledges in some way too, if we're going to circle this around. But just like the idea that you are interviewed all the time or that you are acknowledged in the press does not mean that you are like financially stable. And like I've experienced this, and I know a lot of other people that I like, get hit up to be experts in articles and like interviews and shit. Like it doesn't mean that translates to financial stability in any way.
Right.
Yeah. Athletes, musicians, like there's so much history of like, who was Sydney Sweeney, who's on Euphoria, gave an interview recently where like she's well known, she's famous, right? But she was like, I have to take so many jobs because she's just not gotten to that level. So would you say for chefs, like for celebrity chefs, I'm, let's say, middle of the road, like I've maybe one time eaten at a Michelin-starred restaurant, but like that's an experience most people never will have. Would you say that it's only when they get to sort of like franchise their name, like kind of sell their name out to however many restaurants around the world, that they would actually become like this kind of magnet?
I would say so. I think, once you get to the level of television appearances, talks, food festival appearances, your own line of, clothing, apron, shoes, whatever, that's when you profit. So it's branding, baby. It's all about putting your name on things. Before then, it's just clout, which doesn't pay the rent.
I had a moment in the film. I was getting kind of bored. It's just like dark humor. Like,
Yeah.
And then you see the scene where the woman is talking about how he hit on her and it was inappropriate and all this stuff. And then she stabs him in the leg. And then all of the men have to like run away and and then get caught or whatever. And then all like the women who are left in this space are eating a meal. And I literally yelled out in the theater, like, it's come. And I don't know why I said that so loudly. And I was just waiting for it to be like, that's like, this movie just got so fucking zany that you're just like, yeah, like she totally just put jizz in the foam is jizz. I don't know what it was going to be. Right. I don't know. I just remember that moment being like, this is what's happening now. Right. I love that the guy who, I forget. I watched this so fucking long ago. The one who was like the last to get caught, like was rewarded with like a special like dish of some sort, and you're just like, as much as I like didn't really enjoy watching it, once you get to like the really dark part of it, I feel like it was like a smart satire of the little things in this world, Like I feel like they kind of knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my takeaway. Like I keep trying to like grapple with how I felt about this film because I don't really have warm feelings towards it, but I recognize the sort of intelligence of it, I guess.
Yeah, it was sort of a melange of a lot of things, like Willy Wonka and the Stanford prison experiment. I thought about that a lot, actually.
Yeah.
And just the aesthetics of slasher films. And, all of the Chef's Table, really lovingly 4K rendered documentaries about restaurants and fine dining. It was just a mishmash of all of those things into one movie.
And the fucking chef's house was a recreation of the kitchen with a bed in it. And you're just like, oh my God, when they get to that point. Yeah.
I know. I was half expecting like him having little dolls of everybody in his house because that just would have felt really right.
The staff all sleeping in a barracks together with like a prison toilet in it. I'm also thinking, I mean, I think probably my takeaway from this conversation is I want to reconceive my perspective on the movie as being about fandom, because I think that is probably like, there's so many different levels of it, but also that Tyler, Nicholas Holt's character, is then confronted with like, you think you know so much, but can you cook? And I thought that was a really interesting question because like, I think you can be a critic or you can be a professor or you can be a lover of something without having the art or skill yourself. Like maybe he would be able to cook if he went to culinary school or like
and that's the argument of like that critics always get of like, well, just do it if you know so much about it, just do it yourself. Like if you actually knew what you were doing, you could make a video game or you could make a movie or whatever, which I feel like is a complete misunderstanding of the role of critics.
And as if any of these things are created by one person, right? Like none of those dishes that they were being served was just at the hands of one person. As we talked about with The Last of Us, like no one person makes a game or a TV show. Like there's so much art and skill that goes into it from hundreds of people. But I mean, by the end of the movie, I was just like, LOL, we're being s'mores. Like, it did feel like all of the kind of like ways it was maybe going to be like sort of like arch and a high impassioned critique. At the end, I was just like, man, I don't know. His mom's there too. Like, okay. It ended up being, I think, a lot lighter. And I appreciated that. Like that this wasn't a movie that necessarily like keeps you at arm's length. I appreciated that it was just like you said, like a kind of a typical slasher movie and a little bit stupid, which I was like, thanks for letting me in. When we watched Tar, and I was like, would I have a different understanding of this movie if I knew anything about classical music? Because it does keep you at arm's length by being about something so inaccessible. And this movie is about something really inaccessible for most people, but it kind of lets you enjoy the storytelling. That was my enjoyment of it.
I wanted to actually turn something around on you two because I recently heard that, so there was a consulting chef for this film, Dominique Crenn, who is a really big name in the food world. And she has restaurants in San Francisco, where I live. And her restaurant, Atelier Crenn, is closing down for a little bit for renovation. And it is going to be redesigned by the set designer who designed the restaurant in the menu.
Shut up.
And this is this person's first ever real life restaurant project. And how does that make you feel?
That's so fucking postmodern. We keep talking about Baudrillard and all of I keep bringing up Baudrillard and all of this shit. Like, what the fuck? I knew that she was you guys, like, I saw her name in the credits. That is wild. Sorry. This is not a useful response. That is fucking wild, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm surprised that the set designer for the movie, I don't know why I'm surprised, but that they didn't hire someone who had restaurant experience. But like,
did they just hit it off super well or something?
I think so.
Like, how did that must have been what it is, right? Because set design is not the same. Like, movies are fake.
Right.
Like, if you ever watch like the behind the scenes making of movies, they don't look like real life, right? Like, because of the way camera angles and shit, right? So there's something interesting about that.
I keep coming back to your fashion analogy, but like a costume designer on a film, like there are very few fashion designers who also do costumes for film, and it's always because they were fashion designers first, and then a filmmaker wanted a particular aesthetic from that person, like the Rodarte sisters do it sometimes, but otherwise, like, you wouldn't necessarily go in the opposite direction. Like, you're designing stuff for film that is cheaper than it looks and has Velcro in it, even if it's like set in the 1800s. Like, there's a big difference because of all that artifice. I certainly don't have
How does that make you feel?
Problem with it. I'm just like, oh, that's weird.
It just feels so on the nose. San Francisco is not very good at sarcasm, I think, or irony. We're not good at it because everything's on the nose here. It's just a little bit too dramatic. But I have a sense that people are just not going to, they'll be like, oh, I get to go to a restaurant inspired by the menu. How cool. And not think about like all the content.
Right. Is that like, weren't they going to do like a real, like a Squid game show, right? Like, and it was like, wait, but did you watch Squid Game? I didn't watch Squid Game, and I know that that's weird, right?
Yeah, super fucking weird. And there's something interesting too of like, did Ken and like her team want to do a renovation and therefore they found this person and hit it off and it just made sense to do it? Or was it like, this is a selling point for our new restaurant, right?
Yeah.
Is it a gimmick? Like, is it like a marketing gimmick of some sort?
I mean, it's definitely part of their promo that they've sent me many times.
Wow.
Weird. Well, I'm glad I've eaten there several times, so I never have to go back now.
Yeah, or like just go back and wear like a fireproof suit. You'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just have knives like stashed in my shoes and shit, just in case. All right, y'all. We are going to take a quick break and we will be right back with some Freq Outs.
Hey, FFR listeners. Are you signed up to our Patreon yet? If you're not, you're missing out on special content made exclusively for our patrons. And if you're not a patron, that means that you're not helping me get paid. And if you're not helping me get paid, that means my good little dog Griffin isn't getting the good treats. Head on over to patreon.com/femfreq. That's FEMFREQ. Become a patron to get great content and also to make sure my dog Griffin gets the good treats. Oh, and you get the good treats as well, which in your case would be quality discussions about media.
What's your freak out?
Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Soleil, what are you freaking out about?
So I just finished reading Nona the Ninth, which is the third book of the Locked Tomb series by Tamsyn. It's a sci-fi. Wonderful if you love women who love women and zombies and skeletons. Really wonderful. Just a stupendous book. And there's a dog with 6 legs in it. And it's everything to me. The whole series is just incredible. And it's one of the few allowances that I give myself for reading. It's so memey. The fiction is so memey. It's incredible. Yeah. So
I read the first one. It just didn't do it for me like it did for everybody else. And I expected it to be a lot more queer than it was because it was promoted as this like necromancy queer lesbian thing. So I'm curious how the series progresses, which you obviously liked it.
Yeah. No, I think the sequels to the first book really just ramp it up.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to be really, I think I was captured pretty completely by the first book. So I was really invested.
Yeah, I really wasn't. And it, like, I don't know why, because it has like all of the makings of something I would like. At some point, it just felt like Clue. Like it just, like I feel like I'm just like watching a game of Clue at some point.
I love
but
that shit.
people, yeah, people fucking loved it. So it just didn't hit for me. But yeah.
But Anita, what did hit for you? What are you freaking out about this week?
I'm also freaking out about a book. I just finished Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune, who is the author of Under the Cerulean Sea, which I've definitely freaked out before on this podcast. Klune has this way of telling these like really precious, pure, sincere, heartwarming stories about queer family love, like found family, redemption, like all of these things. And when I finished Under the Cerulean Sea, I was just like, you know, when you like finish a book that you love and you like look around and you're alone and you're like, I just experienced this like transformative thing. Like, who else can I share this with? The same thing happened to me with this one. It's definitely not the vibe that I normally read either. So it was really nice to have something that was like just so sweet. The premise of Under the Whispering Door is that this man, Wallace, who is an attorney and a total piece of shit, just like an awful, awful, awful human, dies. A reaper comes to get him and take him to this way station, which is a tea shop. And the idea of this way station is that you meet this ferryman and he like helps you transition into the next phase of being. And so it is a story about being a better human, right? Like about accountability and recognizing your actions, about finding found family, about like connecting, about helping people, about like being fucking better than you can be and appreciating what is around you. And it's just the sweetest fucking story ever. I highly recommend it. It's Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune.
Awesome.
Kat,
Well,
you are not freaking out about a book.
no, I'm not. I can't read. No, actually, that's like kind of it. Strangely enough, I can only listen to audiobooks anymore. Like, I really struggle to sit down and read a book. It is just a different phase of attention that I can pay at this point in my life. But I watched for the first time Ikiru, a Kurosawa movie from 1952. It was on my mind because I know the current Bill Nighy starring movie Living is a remake of Ikiru, which itself is an adaptation of a short story, I think, from the 1800s, Russian short story. And I wanted to talk about it on this episode because it asks these questions about purpose, and especially about purpose in terms of our work and our careers. Now, this is like Japan in 1952 is a westernized, we're dealing with like a very westernized society in this movie. And our main character is a bureaucrat, a city bureaucrat who learns that he has a terminal illness. So he's trying to figure out how to live. That's what Ikiru means, to live. How to live in the time that he has left. And there's something that really, really struck me in this movie that I can't stop thinking about. He seeks out company from this very young woman who's a friend, kind of a coworker turned friend, who she leaves working at City Hall to go work at a factory. And she finds so much more satisfaction working at this factory. And there are these like questions that feel deeply incongruous to like our modern conversation about work and work-life balance and how we should or shouldn't bring ourselves to the workplace and our whole selves. And she says, so she works at this factory that makes toys, like children's and babies' toys. And she has this little like rabbit that kind of, you wind it up and it jumps across the table. And she says, I feel like I'm making friends with every baby in Japan. And I thought, that does seem lovely. That does seem special to have this kind of job that is physical and tactile, and that what you're doing is connecting to people. And this inspires our bureaucrat to use his bureaucracy work to like fix a cesspool and build a park and have some influence on the people in his city, like actual tactile influence on people's lives. But I still haven't quite unpacked how I feel about this notion of like, that we would say, yes, working in this factory on the assembly line is like the way to feel productive and satisfied. But there was so much really to unpack and to think about, especially today, as there are so many different kinds of work that use different types of labor, emotional labor and mental labor and physical labor in different ways. But it's, I can see why this movie's a classic and that people have loved going to it for years. And it's also, I was just thinking about it in terms of like product and output. So I highly recommend it, and I'm interested to see. It looks like this remake that is in theaters now is also set in the 50s in the UK. And so I'm curious, like I would hope that they're going to kind of make a different movie out of it. I don't think you can just transpose the story necessarily, but I also haven't read the original Russian, so I don't know how, or like a translation of the original Russian, I don't know how much they had to change to set it in Japan in 1952. But I recommend it. I don't know. Talking about this movie also made me hungry. So I really want something good. But that's for me and my gods to figure out. Because that has been our show for today. Soleil, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people learn more about you and read your work, listen to your shows?
Oh gosh. So you can find me on Twitter sometimes at HOOLEIL, or you'll find me on the San Francisco Chronicle website. I literally just changed my job today, so I will not be writing restaurant reviews anymore.
Oh.
I'm their new opinion columnist and cultural critic, so I'll just be writing about all kinds of things.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yes, thank you.
I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and you can find me at Anita Sarkeesian on all the things.
I'm Kat Spada, and I am on Twitter at cat_EX_machina, and Feminist Frequency is on socials at FemFreak.
If you are a Patreon subscriber, be sure to stick around for the bonus episode with our special guest, Soleil Ho.
If you like the show, please help other people find it. Subscribe, rate, and comment on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much
for listening.
Bye.